Two people set out on a peaceful hiking trip in Yosemite and vanished without a trace. What began as a weekend adventure turned into a haunting mystery that baffled investigators for years. But then, long after hope had faded, a drone captured something deep in the forest that no one could have imagined. This is a powerful story of disappearance, discovery, and a daughter's unshakable faith that the truth would one day surface. Before we begin, tell me, where are you watching from today? Drop your location in the comments below. I love hearing from viewers all over the world. Now let's dive into this unforgettable story. Frank Patterson had always been the quiet type, a man who preferred the rustling of pine needles over the noise of city streets. His wife, Linda, was his opposite in many ways. Chatty, warm, and brimming with curiosity, but the two had been inseparable since their college days. After retiring from teaching and nursing respectively, they had spent the better part of a year planning a dream trip that had been postponed too many times by life's demands. Yosemite National Park had always held a special place in their hearts. They had visited once in their 30s, taking a quick tour with a group. But this time was different. This time they would explore it slowly, just the two of them, with no schedule and no pressure, only nature and each other. They arrived in early June of 2012, when the park was beginning to come alive with color and warmth. Wildflowers painted, the meadows and the rivers, swollen from melted snow, rushed with a roar that echoed through the valleys. They checked into a modest but cozy lodge near Curry Village, laughing as they unpacked their bags, Frank insisting on organizing the trail mix, and Linda teasing him about labeling their water bottles. Early the next morning, they set out on the Mist Trail, one of the most popular but challenging hikes in the park. According to the lodge clerk who had spoken with them last, they were hoping to make it as far as the top of Nevada Fall, take some photos, maybe picnic, and return by mid-afternoon. But the hours passed and evening came. Then darkness fell, and the Pattersons did not return. At first, no one panicked. Hikers often underestimated the time they needed and occasionally returned late. But by morning, concern turned to alarm. The lodge staff contacted park rangers, who began an initial search. When Megan, Frank, and Linda's only daughter was notified, she flew in immediately. By then, a full-scale search operation had been launched. Helicopters hovered over cliffs and valleys. Search dogs sniffed along ridges and riverbanks. Dozens of volunteers combed the terrain. Flyers with their smiling faces, Frank's silver beard and Linda's honey blonde curls, were posted on trailheads and visitor centers. But Yosemite, for all its beauty, is vast and wild. For every sun-drenched meadow, there are miles of dense forest and treacherous ledges. After 2 exhausting weeks, the official search was scaled back. Rangers cited the dangers of continuing in areas that were too remote or too steep. Hope began to wane. Megan, refusing to give up, pleaded with authorities, begged them to keep looking. But eventually, even she had to return home to Oregon. The loss sat like a stone in her chest, heavy and unmoving. The official conclusion was grim but vague. The couple likely got lost or injured and succumbed to the elements. But that explanation never satisfied Megan. Her parents were experienced hikers, cautious and well-prepared. They always left notes about their routes, always checked in. It didn't make sense that they would just vanish without a trace, without a single call for help or signal. The only item ever recovered was a partial boot print found near a washout, 2 miles off the Mist Trail, too inconclusive to draw any answers from. Back in their hometown of Eugene, Oregon, a memorial service was held. Friends gathered in a church, filled with flowers and framed photos of the Pattersons. People shared stories of Frank's dry humor and Linda's way of making everyone feel welcome. But it all felt unfinished. There were no answers, no remains to lay to rest. Just an ache that settled deep into the bones of everyone who knew them. Yet, even as the rest of the world moved on, Megan didn't. She held on to every voicemail her mother ever left, reread old emails, and kept her parents' bedroom untouched. Every June, she returned to Yosemite on her own, hiking the trails they once loved, hoping, against all logic, that she might see something the others had missed. Something that would bring her parents back, if not in body, then at least in truth. Years passed, the world changed, the flyers faded, but the question never did. What happened to Frank and Linda Patterson? It would take nearly a decade, and a stranger with a drone, to finally uncover what nature had buried, and what love refused to forget. Even as the years rolled forward and new faces checked into the same lodge where Frank and Linda Patterson had once stayed, their story never quite left the collective memory of the people who knew them or the place that had swallowed them whole. In Eugene, Oregon, their neighborhood still bore subtle reminders: an overgrown garden left untended, wind chimes that clinked softly in the wind by the front porch, and the occasional mailbox still stuffed with catalogs bearing Linda's name. Their home, quiet and still, became a place frozen in time, a monument not to death, but to waiting. Megan Patterson had grown up in that house, chasing fireflies in the backyard, helping her father stain the fence, watching her mother bake lemon bars for church picnics. Now, as an adult in her 30s with her own life and a teaching job, she found herself constantly pulled back to it, unable to let go. The idea of selling the house felt like betrayal, like closing the last door on the people she loved most. But what tormented her more than grief was the emptiness of not knowing. She didn't have a grave to visit or final words to remember. She had no answers, just silence. Every year on the anniversary of their disappearance, Megan would post a message on social media, sharing a memory or an old photograph. Her mom sitting cross-legged on a picnic blanket with a paperback in her hands, her dad wearing that same ridiculous floppy hat and looking over a trail map like he was solving a mystery. The posts always gained attention, particularly among hiking communities. People who never even knew the Pattersons would comment, offering sympathy, prayers, and sometimes their own stories of lost loved ones in the wild. It was like Megan had unknowingly become the face of a quiet movement, those left behind by the missing. The rangers at Yosemite, too, hadn't forgotten. Some had retired, new ones had come aboard, but Frank and Linda's names were still spoken around campfires during orientation weekends. The older rangers would tell the story in that half-wary, half-reverent tone reserved for the wilderness's unsolved mysteries. A few unofficially made it a habit to keep an eye out for anything unusual in the area near the Mist Trail, especially in the early summers when the water ran high and tourists veered off track. Nothing ever turned up. But the tale of the missing Oregon couple became part of the oral fabric of the park, another ghost folded into the mountains. Megan never stopped going back. Each June, like clockwork, she booked a room in the same lodge, always requesting room 14, the last one her parents stayed in. The staff, many of whom were new by now, began to recognize her. Some whispered about her in respectful tones. "That's the daughter of the hikers who vanished, right?" She would walk the Mist Trail alone, then hike further if she had the stamina, often stopping near Vernal Fall just to sit and listen. Sometimes she brought along laminated copies of her parents' photos and posted them on trailheads, a subtle plea to strangers to remain vigilant. A few times hikers had come back to her with items they'd found, a water bottle, a scrap of flannel, even a rusted carabiner, but none were ever identified as her parents. In 2016, a local newspaper in Oregon published a retrospective titled "Gone Without a Trace: 4 years since the Pattersons disappeared." The article reignited public interest. Megan was interviewed, sitting on the front steps of her parents' home, her eyes distant but voice calm. "I don't believe they meant to disappear," she said. "I believe they got hurt or lost, and I believe they did everything they could to survive. I also believe they left behind something we just haven't found yet." That final sentence lingered with readers, sparking online conversations and even amateur search efforts from hiking enthusiasts. Some called themselves trail detectives, and while most leads amounted to nothing, Megan appreciated the renewed energy. It made her feel less alone in her search. One ranger, David Sloan, had been among the first to respond back in 2012. Now, nearing retirement, he still carried a photo of the Pattersons in his locker. On slow days, he would take it out, studying their faces, wondering what had really happened. He too had hiked the Mist Trail dozens of times since their disappearance, eyes scanning for clues, ears tuned for something out of place. Once, he thought he saw something, a flash of silver deep in the underbrush, but it turned out to be a candy wrapper. Still, he never dismissed the case as a lost cause. In his heart, he believed the mountains had hidden the Pattersons well, but not forever. Over time, Megan began compiling everything into a thick, leather-bound journal: maps, timelines, news articles, her own notes, and a growing list of questions that had no answers. The journal became her sacred object, the thing she reached for on quiet evenings and restless mornings. On the inside cover, she wrote a simple phrase: "The wilderness remembers. So will I." She didn't know then how prophetic those words would become, how a piece of technology drifting quietly above the treetops would soon find what people on the ground had missed for nearly a decade. But she felt it, somewhere deep in her bones, that the story wasn't finished yet. And neither was she. Over the years, the mystery of Frank and Linda Patterson's disappearance began to take on a life of its own, spreading beyond their hometown and the confines of Yosemite. It became one of those stories whispered around campfires, mentioned on internet forums, and dissected in hushed voices among hikers standing at the trailhead with maps in hand and the Pattersons' old flyer still tacked to the notice board. And with every year that passed, the vacuum of real answers only fed the imagination of those desperate to make sense of it. Some clung to simple explanations. They theorized that Frank and Linda had ventured too far off trail, gotten disoriented in the dense forest, and succumbed to the elements, perhaps slipping down a ravine or becoming trapped under a rockfall. Others suggested a medical emergency, a heart attack, a fall, a twisted ankle that escalated into tragedy as night and cold crept in. But even those straightforward ideas left nagging questions. If it had been that simple, wouldn't something have been found? A backpack? A piece of clothing? A trail of disturbed brush or a broken branch? But there had been nothing. Nothing but that faint boot print, smudged and half sunken in the soil, miles from where they were supposed to be. As with all unsolved disappearances, the absence of clarity invited speculation of a darker nature. There were rumors, whispered at ranger stations and posted anonymously online. Some believed the Pattersons had encountered a wild animal, perhaps a mountain lion or even a bear, and never had a chance to defend themselves. Others suspected they had stumbled onto something they weren't meant to see: illegal activity, a hidden grow operation, or worse. One particularly persistent theory suggested that someone had been watching them, following them, and that what happened in the woods wasn't an accident at all. Megan read every theory she could find, even the wildest ones. At first, she dismissed the more far-fetched claims, chalking them up to internet nonsense or people desperate to play detective. But in her quietest moments, when sleep refused to come and her parents' voices echoed in her memories, she would stare at the ceiling and wonder, what if it wasn't just an accident? What if someone out there knew exactly what happened? In 2017, a podcast episode dedicated to America's most puzzling national park disappearances featured the Patterson case. It was a popular show hosted by a former journalist who specialized in true crime and wilderness mysteries. The episode was titled Lost in Yosemite, and it explored not just the Pattersons case, but others too: lone hikers who had vanished, children who'd slipped away from campsites, entire groups that had left behind nothing but questions. The podcast gave the case a second life, drawing in thousands of listeners who were captivated by the eerie silence of Yosemite's deeper trails. Megan agreed to speak on the episode, her voice measured and careful. She didn't make wild accusations or point fingers. She simply told her parents' story, her story, and what it felt like to live in a world where the people she loved most had vanished like morning mist. The episode led to a surge in tips. Some were sincere, some strange, others plainly fabricated. A woman from Arizona swore she had seen Linda in a grocery store just 3 weeks before. A man from Nevada sent blurry photos of two people he'd seen hiking in 2015, convinced they were the missing couple. Rangers followed up, but nothing ever came of it. The leads fizzled like sparks on wet tinder. Then there were the amateur searchers, men and women armed with topographic maps, GoPros, and backpacks full of hope. They called themselves Wilderness Truth Seekers and documented their efforts on YouTube, drawing modest followings. Megan reached out to a few of them, sharing maps and timelines explaining her parents' habits. A few met her in person during her June pilgrimages to the park. Some genuinely wanted to help. Others, she suspected, just wanted content. But she welcomed them all. As long as people were still looking, the story was still alive. One of those searchers was Tyler Griggs, a former Army medic turned nature photographer who had taken up drone flying as a hobby. Tyler was thoughtful, respectful, and didn't seek attention like some of the others. He reached out to Megan after the podcast aired, sharing a detailed plan to survey less accessible areas of the Yosemite backcountry. His email was meticulous: coordinates, elevation data, battery plans, terrain maps. Megan was impressed. She had received plenty of messages from people promising miracles, but Tyler's was different. He wasn't selling anything. He wasn't theorizing. He was just quietly offering to help. They exchanged a few emails. She gave him what she had: her journal notes, the park ranger contacts, the weather records from that fateful day. Tyler promised to fly the drone in the late summer when the trees were less thick and the light better for scanning the underbrush. Still, Megan tried not to get her hopes up. There had been too many dead ends, too many what-ifs, too many apologies that led nowhere. She had trained herself to feel numb when a new theory emerged, to nod politely when someone offered their 2 cents. But something about Tyler's calm, focused determination settled in her like a faint ember that refused to go out. He wasn't chasing headlines. He wasn't digging for drama. He was just looking, and sometimes that was enough. By the end of that year, the theories had all but run dry again. The podcast buzz faded, the online forums grew quiet, and Megan went back to teaching, going through the motions with a familiar ache in her chest. The only thing that had changed was a date scribbled in her calendar for the following spring. Tyler. Drone launch. She didn't know it then, but that quiet note would soon mark the beginning of the most shocking chapter of all. It was a crisp April morning when Tyler Griggs packed his gear into the back of his truck. The Sierra Nevada peaks dusted with snow in the distance, sunlight shimmering faintly on their white shoulders. The cold air bit at his fingers as he secured the hard case holding his drone, an advanced model with high-resolution thermal imaging and obstacle avoidance software he had spent months upgrading. Tyler wasn't new to this kind of mission. Over the past 2 years, he'd used his drone to document landslides, monitor wildlife movements, and even help locate a lost dog deep in the Angeles National Forest. But this time felt different. He wasn't flying for views or content or for a friend's favor. He was flying for something that had haunted a daughter for nearly a decade. For 2 souls lost to the forest, whose story refused to be swallowed by silence. He had chosen his location carefully, an area just east of the mist trail that led toward a rocky outcropping known among seasoned hikers as Ghost Ledge. The terrain there was rugged, often bypassed by casual trekkers due to its steep inclines and loose shale. According to maps and historical weather patterns, it was plausible the Pattersons could have veered off course and sought shelter there if disoriented. Tyler had scouted it on foot the previous fall, but found it too dangerous to navigate solo. That's where the drone came in. With it, he could access areas humans couldn't without risking their lives. The propellers whirred to life with a rising hum, and within seconds, the drone lifted into the sky like a silent hawk scanning the wilderness. Tyler kept his eyes on the monitor as the camera swooped over tree canopies, traced the curves of ridges, and glided through narrow gaps between granite cliffs. He'd flown in Yosemite before, but today there was a strange tension in the air, a stillness in the forest below that felt more expectant than quiet, as if the land itself knew something was about to be uncovered. For the first 2 hours he found nothing unusual. Trees, rock, more trees, some signs of animal movement, even a deer darting through a narrow clearing. Then, as he panned across a slope cloaked in thick pine, something odd caught his eye. It wasn't movement, it was the opposite. A fixed shape among the brush, something straight and unnatural jutting out from beneath a fallen tree. Tyler hovered the drone, zoomed in. At first it looked like a branch, weather-worn and gray. But the longer he stared, the more it resolved into something unmistakable. A hiking pole, not broken, just there, sticking out of the earth as if someone had placed it deliberately. His heart began to race. He adjusted the angle, drifting lower. A few feet from the pole lay what looked like a faint depression in the brush, almost like a body had once lain there and time had tried to erase it. 20 feet beyond that, the unmistakable glint of fabric, blue, sun-bleached, torn in places but stubbornly clinging to a tree root. Tyler swallowed hard. He snapped high-res stills and marked the coordinates before bringing the drone back, hands trembling. He knew better than to assume. It could be from another hiker. It could be debris. But his gut told him otherwise. It told him that after nearly 10 years, someone had finally found something real. He didn't wait. He uploaded the images, annotated the terrain data, and sent an email to Megan with a simple subject line: "I think I found them." He expected a delay. Instead, she called within 5 minutes, her voice shaking with restrained emotion. "Are you sure?" she asked. Tyler hesitated, then answered honestly, "I'm not 100%, but I've never seen anything like this out here, and it lines up with your map." The park rangers responded swiftly. Tyler shared his footage with them, and within 48 hours, a small search team set out to the coordinates. The terrain was as treacherous as Tyler had guessed, steep, uneven, and tangled with brush. It took them nearly 2 days to reach the site on foot, but when they did, everything changed. The hiking pole was real. The fabric was a jacket, Patagonia, size medium, sun-bleached but intact. Inside one of its pockets, protected by a plastic bag, was a laminated map marked with red ink. A name scrawled in fading pen: Frank Patterson. The moment the news broke, Megan fell to her knees in her classroom. Her students had just left for lunch and she was alone. She didn't sob, not at first. She just sat there, stunned, staring at her phone like the world had turned upside down. After 9 long years, the waiting had given way to something real. She called her aunt, then her parents' old church pastor, then sat in silence, holding the phone to her chest as the room spun. The park confirmed more findings the next day. Remnants of a campsite tucked into a hollow beneath the rock ledge, a small metal pot, a tattered notebook, and 2 skeletal remains partially covered by debris. DNA testing would take time, but no one doubted who they were. The Pattersons had been found. Not by coincidence, not by a miracle, but because someone had kept looking. For Tyler, the moment brought a strange mix of triumph and sorrow. He didn't seek recognition, but the story quickly spread. News outlets reached out. Podcasts wanted interviews. He declined most. The only person he sat down with was Megan. They met in the same lodge where her parents had stayed, in the same room that still smelled faintly of pine and old curtains. She hugged him, long and hard, and when they pulled apart, neither said a word. They didn't need to. Outside, Yosemite stood still, the trees tall and watchful as always. But in the quiet hum of the drone, in the careful work of one persistent soul, the wilderness had finally surrendered its secret. Long before it had a name, the ledge was nothing more than an overlooked wrinkle in Yosemite's vast granite skin, tucked away beneath a curtain of pine and stone where the map grew vague and the light rarely touched the earth. Even seasoned, hikers had passed near it without knowing it was there, for it lay just beyond the natural line of sight, shielded by boulders stacked like ancient guardians. It wasn't until the rangers followed the drone's coordinates that the ledge revealed itself, a narrow shelf about 12 feet wide, nestled beneath a slanting overhang of stone, almost invisible unless viewed from above. It faced east, catching morning light, but by afternoon it was cloaked in shadow, the kind of place that could offer safety or concealment for someone lost, hurt, or simply trying to survive. The recovery team moved with reverence. They cataloged every object meticulously: a rusted multi-tool, a half-crushed water filter, an empty tin of almonds, a faded blue scarf. The fire pit, ringed with stones, still held the ghosts of charred wood, long cooled. Most striking was the presence of order. Someone had tried to build a life here, however briefly. A flat patch of dirt had been swept clear. The pot was balanced on a makeshift grate of wire. Near the edge of the ledge, tucked beneath a rock, was a small tin box sealed with duct tape. Inside it, protected against the elements, was a stack of pages torn from a notebook, each carefully dated in looping, deliberate handwriting. They were Linda's. Megan sat alone in the ranger station's back office when they handed her the copies. The original pages would go to forensics, but these were for her. She ran her fingers over the first sheet, her breath catching. It was dated 5 days after the disappearance, June 16th, 2013. The first lines were simple. "We lost the trail. Frank says we took a wrong turn near the ridge. We're trying to backtrack, but everything looks the same." Megan read each word aloud, slowly, as though they might disappear if spoken too quickly. "Still have some food. Water's low. Frank's ankle is swelling. I told him not to push, but he keeps smiling like it'll all be okay." The entries continued, each one painting a clearer picture of those days in the wilderness. They had tried to climb back up to the trail but failed. The ground was too steep, the footing too loose. Frank had slipped, twisting his ankle further. They rationed water, boiled what they found. On the third night, a storm moved in. Trees snapped in the wind. Linda wrote of lying awake, holding Frank's hand beneath the ledge, praying. "I can't sleep. I keep hearing sounds, not animals, something else, like footsteps, but far away. I think I'm just scared. I don't want to tell Frank." Days blurred together. Frank's condition worsened. He stopped eating. His ankle turned purple, then black. Linda's tone shifted, less hopeful, more focused. "I need to stay strong. I need to be the one who keeps us alive." She wrote of searching alone, calling out, waving her arms from a high rock in case someone saw. But no one came. "Sometimes I think I hear helicopters, but I can't see anything. I try to make smoke, but it disappears into the trees." The final entry was dated June 26th, 10 days after they vanished. "Frank's gone. He passed this morning, peacefully. I held his face in my hands and sang our song. I don't know how long I'll last. I'm going to try to climb again tomorrow. If I don't make it, and someone finds this, please tell Megan we love her, that we didn't give up, that we were together, and we were not afraid." The pages trembled in Megan's hands. The room was silent, save for her breath and the soft rustle of the copies. For so many years, she had imagined that moment, what their last words might have been, if they'd thought of her, if they'd been alone. And now she knew. They had thought of her, every day, until the very end. The next morning, accompanied by Tyler and a forest ranger, Megan was allowed to visit the ledge. The climb was steep, requiring ropes and careful footing. When they reached it, the air felt different, thinner somehow, like the weight of the years hung heavy in the trees. She stood in the place her parents had lived their final days, where they had fought to survive, loved one another, and waited for a rescue that never came. There were no words for it, no prayers strong enough to hold the ache. So she stood in silence, her hands clutching a photograph of them on their wedding day, and let the wind carry her tears. Later, Tyler set up a small memorial, too smooth. Stones stacked beside the fire pit, one marked with an F, the other an L. They didn't want to disturb the site more than necessary. Nature had already claimed it back, and that felt right. As they descended, Megan paused one last time and looked back. The ledge, half shrouded in shade, now felt like something sacred. Not just the place where her parents had died, but the place where they had lived their final chapter, with courage and grace. In the weeks that followed, the Park Service issued a formal report, confirming the remains belonged to Frank and Linda Patterson. The cause of death was exposure and injury, tragic, but without signs of foul play. Yet for Megan, the story wasn't just about closure. It was about bearing witness, about honoring the truth that had taken nearly a decade to come to light. She had feared her parents would be forgotten, just names on a poster, a cold case, file lost in a cabinet. But now, they had been found, their story told. And high above the valley floor, on a ledge once hidden from the world, Something sacred had finally come into the light. The story broke on a quiet Tuesday morning. It began with a local radio segment. Remains found in Yosemite May belonged to couple missing since 2013. But by noon, it had leapt from California newsrooms to the national stage. By evening, the names Frank and Linda Patterson were on every major network, and their daughter's face, drawn with grief and resilience, became the image that flickered across televisions from coast to coast. The country leaned in, hungry for every detail. They weren't just another tragic statistic. They were a love story frozen in time, a mystery finally unraveled. And Megan, once the silent girl with the missing parents, was now the keeper of a legacy the whole nation seemed desperate to understand. At first, she didn't know how to feel. Grief had lived inside her for so long that its edges had grown dull. But now, with the media circling and strangers reaching out from every corner of the country, something raw and unfamiliar stirred within her. She couldn't step outside her home without reporters waiting by the gate. Questions came like waves, gentle from some, invasive from others. What do you remember about the day they left? Did your parents ever talk about being afraid? Of getting lost? How does it feel to finally know what happened? Megan answered what she could, but often she found herself retreating into silence, holding the notebook pages in her lap like a lifeline. Her inbox overflowed with emails. Some offered condolences. Others shared their own stories of loss. Sons, daughters, mothers, brothers, vanished hikers never found, mysteries that lingered like open wounds. One message in particular stopped her cold. It was from a woman named Clarissa in Oregon. Her brother David had disappeared while hiking the Pacific Crest Trail in 2009. I never knew what happened to him, Clarissa wrote, but reading about your parents and the way they left behind those notes, it gave me peace somehow. They didn't die afraid. They died holding on to each other. That means something, doesn't it? Megan wept when she read that, not just for herself, but for Clarissa, for all the people who would never get a final chapter. Somehow she had become a symbol for them too. The pressure grew. Talk shows called. Documentarians offered book deals and podcast contracts. A popular daytime host invited her to share her brave story before a live studio audience. Megan declined them all. She wasn't ready to become a headline, but one request did catch her attention. A letter from a historian at a small university in Nevada arrived in a neat envelope, handwritten in careful script. He'd spent 20 years researching American disappearances in national parks. There's a story in here, he wrote, not just of tragedy, but of wilderness, survival, and love. If you'd ever be willing to talk, I'd be honored to listen. There was no pressure, no camera, just one person reaching out with curiosity and compassion. Megan tucked it away for another day, but it stayed in her thoughts. What she didn't expect was the way the nation embraced her parents. People visited Yosemite not just to hike, but to stand quietly near the trailhead where the Pattersons had last been seen. Some left notes, folded into plastic bags tucked beneath stones. Others left flowers or small carvings of birds and trees. Someone built a tiny wooden bench just off the main path with a plaque that read, "In memory of those who walk bravely into the wild and the ones who wait for them to come home." Megan visited once, early in the morning before the crowds arrived. She sat on that bench, ran her fingers over the wood grain, and let the sun warm her shoulders. For the first time in years, the forest didn't feel cruel. It felt sacred. The Park Service contacted her about the ledge. There was debate about what to do: leave it untouched, mark it with a memorial, or seal it from access altogether. Some argued it should be kept private, a quiet place for family only. Others believed it should be preserved, a part of the park's long and complicated history. Megan listened to every opinion, weighed every word. In the end, she made her decision. "Let it be," she said. "Let nature have it. Let it stay hidden like it was. That place belongs to the mountain now." What surprised her most was how many people told her they felt changed by the story. A man in Texas wrote to say he canceled a business trip to spend the weekend with his aging parents. A teenager in Illinois said she read the article aloud to her grandmother and cried with her. People weren't just fascinated, they were moved. They saw in Frank and Linda something pure, something that reminded them of what mattered most. Megan didn't ask for that role, but she bore it gently, like the teacher she had always been. Not lecturing, just holding space for others to feel. Still behind the public spotlight, grief moved like an undertow. There were days she couldn't eat, nights when sleep refused to come. She would wake suddenly, certain she heard her father's voice, only to sit in the dark with nothing but the sound of her breath. Healing, she realized, wasn't a straight line. It looped and curved, sometimes doubling back, sometimes freezing in place. But there was one truth she held onto tightly. Her parents had not been forgotten. Not by her, not by the world, and certainly not by the land that had held them all those years. She began writing again, first in a journal, then in longer letters to no one in particular. Thoughts spilled onto the page, memories, dreams, fragments of conversations she'd once had. She wrote of Frank's laugh, deep and sudden, of Linda's way of humming when she folded laundry, of their final days in that hidden place, and the courage it must have taken to face each one. Maybe someday she would share those words. Maybe not. But for now it was enough just to write, to remember, to feel. The first night she couldn't sleep, Megan found herself back at her parents' house. It had been untouched for years, a capsule sealed in time. After they disappeared, she couldn't bear to clear it out. The house stood silent through seasons and storms, waiting for someone to come home. Now, finally ready, Megan stepped into the dim front hallway, where the scent of aged paper and dust clung to the air. The pictures on the wall stared back at her, her parents smiling on. A mountain summit, their arms around each other, eyes crinkled with sun and laughter. She moved slowly, not wanting to disturb the stillness, as though they might still be somewhere just out of sight. In the back bedroom, her father's old oak desk sat beneath the window, its surface scattered with yellowing maps, trail guides, and an old brass compass that still gleamed when it caught the light. Megan pulled open a drawer, expecting to find what she always remembered: rubber bands, faded receipts, mismatched pens, but instead, tucked at the back, beneath a stack of envelopes, was a worn leather-bound journal. Her breath caught. She hadn't known this existed. With trembling hands, she lifted it out, the leather warm and soft from years of touch. A faint scent of pine clung to its pages. She sat cross-legged on the carpet and opened it slowly, as if it might fall apart. The first page held her father's handwriting, unmistakable in its bold, uneven slant. June 2010, Linda's birthday trip to Yosemite. Megan's heart tightened. This wasn't just a journal. It was a record of their hikes, their dreams, their moments in the wilderness together. She turned the pages, and there they were, sketches of trails, notes about wildflowers her mother loved, reminders like, "Linda hates freeze-dried peas. Bring more trail mix next time." In one entry, Frank wrote, "Saw a pair of bald eagles circling above El Capitan. Linda said they reminded her of us. She always says the most poetic things when she's got dirt on her boots." Page after page unfolded a portrait of a life lived deliberately, joyfully. There were musings about nature, stories of quiet moments by campfires, and reflections on the things that made them feel most alive. Megan read until her eyes blurred, her heart heavy with love and longing. Then, she found something she hadn't expected, a section written just months before they disappeared. The tone had shifted. Frank spoke more of legacy, of wanting to leave something behind, not in the sense of money or possessions, but something deeper. "I think about Megan a lot when we're out here," he wrote. "She's so much like her mother, fierce, kind, curious. If anything ever happened to us out here, I hope she knows that we were at peace, that this place gave us more than it ever took, and that love, real love, doesn't vanish. It echoes." Megan closed the journal and pressed it to her chest. Outside the window, wind stirred the branches of the pine trees. Their needles danced against the glass, as if whispering secrets. For the first time in weeks, she felt something shift inside. Her, not closure, Because loss like this never fully closes. But connection. A thread drawn across time, linking her parents' final days with the countless others they had lived and loved. It wasn't just the pages Linda had left behind on the ledge. It was this journal, too. A quieter record. A trail of thought and feeling winding through the years like a footpath beneath the trees. Inspired, Megan began creating a space to gather it all. She called it Echoes from the Pines, and it started as a digital archive: photos, scanned journal pages, maps of their routes, and audio recordings of herself reading her parents' words aloud. She didn't publicize it widely, just shared it with friends, family, and a few of the people who had written her letters. But word spread, gently at first, then faster. Hikers, nature lovers, and those who had lost someone in the wild reached out. They sent their own stories, their own journals, their own fragments of love and loss. One woman shared a note she'd found in her father's coat pocket before his funeral, a sketch of a pine tree and the words, "Still reaching for the light." Another man, whose wife had passed away on a trail in Colorado, submitted a recording of himself reading her final postcard home. Each story was a stone in a growing cairn of memory, stacked high with care and intention. Megan didn't expect what came next. A nonprofit organization dedicated to wilderness safety and memorial preservation offered to help turn Echoes from the Pines into something lasting. A foundation in her parents' names, aimed at supporting search and rescue efforts and creating safe memorials for families like hers. She was hesitant at first. She didn't want to exploit her parents' memory. But as she spoke to more families, more hikers, more souls marked by the same kind of grief, she saw the purpose forming. This wasn't about headlines anymore. It was about healing and honoring, and using loss to light the path for others. 1. Crisp afternoon, standing beneath the towering pines near the trail where her parents began their last hike. Megan read from the journal at a small gathering. Just a few dozen people, friends, rangers, fellow hikers, stood with her. She read aloud her father's words from that last entry in the journal, his quiet hope that love echoes. As her voice trembled and the wind stirred the trees above them, it was clear to everyone there. It did. It echoed in every story shared, every footprint on the trail, every moment someone chose to remember rather than forget. It had been nearly a month since Megan launched Echoes from the Pines, and in that time, hundreds of messages poured in. Stories, photos, even old voice recordings sent by families who had carried the same quiet ache she had known for years. Most were from kind strangers offering solace or solidarity. But one email, buried deep in her inbox, was different. It was from a name she didn't recognize at first: Jeremy Hill. The subject line read, "About your parents. Please, read this in private." She clicked on it late one night, sitting alone at the dining table with only a lamp casting warm light across the pages of her father's journal. Jeremy's message was short, hesitant. "I'm the drone pilot who found the remains. I wasn't part of the search and rescue. I was flying recreationally. What I found wasn't random. I need to tell you the full story. But I didn't share everything with the authorities. There's something I left out, something I buried. If you're willing to talk, I'll meet you. In person. Please." The email was dated a week ago. Megan's heart thudded as she reread it, and 1,000 questions spun in her head. Why? Would he keep something secret? What could he possibly have seen that hadn't been reported? The next morning, she responded with a cautious yes. They agreed to meet at a coffee shop in Oakhurst, a small town just outside Yosemite's southern. 8. When she arrived, Jeremy was already there, seated at a back table, fidgeting with his mug. He was younger than she'd expected, maybe late 30s, with a pale nervousness about him that suggested he hadn't slept much. He stood awkwardly when she approached, then sat again, eyes darting around as if afraid of being overheard. "Appreciate you coming," he said, voice low and tense. I wasn't sure if I should reach out, but after seeing what you've done with the foundation, I figured you deserved the truth." Megan nodded, staying silent. She wanted him to get to it, to speak what had clearly been weighing on him, He leaned forward. "I didn't just find your parents' remains," he said. "I found their camera." Megan blinked. "Their camera?" Jeremy nodded. "A small digital one. It was wedged between two rocks, just below the ledge where they were found. I saw the strap sticking out of the rubble. It was covered in dirt, but it still worked. Battery nearly dead, but it turned on. I saw the photos, and a video. I panicked. I didn't know what to do. I told myself I'd hand it over, but instead, I kept it." His voice dropped to a whisper. "It didn't seem like something for the police. It felt personal, like it was meant for family." Megan's chest tightened. "Where is it now?" Jeremy reached into his backpack and slowly pulled out a padded case. Inside was a compact silver camera, worn but intact. He slid it across the table. "I'm sorry," he said, eyes glistening. "I didn't mean to hide it. I just didn't know how to face it." Her fingers trembled as she touched the camera. She didn't speak. She couldn't. The weight of it in her palm felt like holding a heartbeat. She clutched it to her chest and nodded. "Thank you," she whispered. "You did the right thing." Jeremy sighed, shoulders slumping. "There's one more thing. I watched the video. I shouldn't have, but I did. It's short, maybe a minute. Your dad's holding the camera. He's talking to you, to Megan. He says if anyone finds this, to tell you that they weren't afraid, that they loved you, that the view was beautiful." Jeremy wiped his eyes. He turns the camera to your mom and she waves. She's smiling. She says, "Tell Megan we danced even here, especially here." And then it ends. Megan felt her throat close. She couldn't speak. A deep warmth surged through her, painful and beautiful all at once. Her parents hadn't just left behind words on paper. They had left their voices, their faces, a final goodbye preserved not in memory but in motion. Something living, something that breathed. She thanked Jeremy again, this time more firmly, and left the cafe with the camera clutched tightly. Back at her cabin near the forest's edge, she locked the door, drew the curtains, and sat in the soft evening light with the camera resting on her lap. She turned it on. The battery icon blinked red, but it powered up. She scrolled past the photos first, images of towering trees, wide-open skies, her mother smiling in a hammock, her father giving a goofy thumbs-up beside a trail marker. And then she found it, the final file, titled simply, "For Megan." She pressed play. The screen flickered, then settled. Her father's face filled the frame, sunburned and scruffy, but his eyes warm and sure. He held the camera out, voice shaking just slightly. "Hey, kiddo," he began, smiling. "If you're seeing this, well, guess we didn't quite make it back. But don't be sad. We had a good run, the best, really. And this place, my God, it's something else. Your mom and I, we're okay. We're together." He turned the camera toward Linda, who grinned and blew a kiss. "Tell Megan," she said, her voice bright. "We danced. Even here, especially here." Then the image stilled. The screen went black. Megan sat in silence, her face wet with tears. But for once, it wasn't grief that hollowed her. It was grace. A sense that something long broken had mended, not perfectly, but beautifully. She played the video again. And again. She watched it until the battery died and the screen went dark. Then she held the camera close and whispered, "I heard you. I always will." The next morning, Megan woke before sunrise, the memory of her parents' final message still glowing like a lantern inside her. She sat on the cabin porch, wrapped in a wool blanket, cradling a cup of coffee while the forest slowly stirred awake. Mist clung to the pine branches, and birds sang the first tentative notes of morning. For the first time in years, she didn't feel lost. She felt guided. The video hadn't just brought closure, it had planted something new inside her, a seed of purpose. And as she watched the mist lift over the trees, Megan knew exactly what she had to do. Her parents' story couldn't just end with their final words on camera. It needed a path, a place, something real that others could walk, where their lives, and the countless others lost to the wilderness, could be remembered, honored, and carried forward. That's when the idea for the memorial trail took root. It started as a simple thought, a hiking trail dedicated to those who had vanished in Yosemite's vast, mysterious expanse. But the more she imagined it, the more it grew. It wouldn't just be a trail. It would be a living story, a winding passage of memory carved through the forest, marked with names, photographs, and pieces of the lives left behind. A place where families could grieve, celebrate, and connect with the ones they lost in the beauty of nature. Just like her parents had asked. She brought the idea to the local rangers first, expecting bureaucracy and resistance. But to her surprise, they listened. She showed them the video, carefully, respectfully, and spoke from her heart. Jeremy came too, standing beside her as she explained the vision. A loop trail near the south entrance, accessible but secluded, with placards and resting areas, each one telling a true story. She wasn't just asking for a memorial, she was offering to build it, raise funds, and lead the effort. The room was silent when she finished, the kind of silence that carries weight, that says something real had just passed through. Then the senior ranger, an older woman with silver hair tied neatly behind her head, nodded and said, "I think it's time we did something like this." With their tentative approval, Megan launched into action. She reached out to families who had contacted her through the foundation, inviting them to share photos, letters, anything they wanted to include. To her astonishment, people responded with overwhelming generosity. A mother sent in her son's favorite hiking boots. A brother offered the final page of his sister's trail journal. Even the rangers pitched in, offering guidance, helping scout locations, cutting through red tape. Jeremy, now a quiet but constant presence, offered his drone footage to help map the route. The trail began to form, not just on the landscape, but in the hearts of those who had long carried silent grief. The first wooden signpost went up in early fall, hand-carved with the words "Echoes Trail," burned deep into the oak. Beneath it, a simple plaque read, "In memory of those who walked into nature and never returned, may their stories guide us." Megan stood before it, hammer still in hand, her eyes misty but steady. A cool breeze stirred the trees, and for a fleeting second she thought she could hear laughter. Her father's chuckle, her mother's bright voice carried through the pines. The trail wound gently through the woods, dotted with story stops. One featured a watercolor sketch by a missing artist. Another played audio from a voicemail left by a lost backpacker. Megan added a bench at the halfway point, facing a sunlit clearing, with a quote from her mother's last video. "We danced, even here, especially here." It became the trail's soul. Hikers wept there. Others left wildflowers. Some just sat in silence, watching sunlight flicker through the trees. The grand opening drew a quiet crowd, dozens of families, hikers, volunteers, and rangers. There was no ribbon cutting, no speeches, just a gentle procession along the new path. Megan walked near the front, clutching the same camera her father had held. At the clearing, she paused. Slowly, she set the camera on the bench and whispered, "You're home." Afterward, people lingered. A man knelt to read every plaque. A little girl left a crayon drawing of her aunt beneath a photo. The forest, once a place of unanswered questions, had become something else entirely. It was now a space of remembrance and healing. As the seasons changed, the trail remained, snow blanketing the signs in winter, wildflowers curling around the stones in spring. And Megan, now living in Oakhurst full-time, returned often, not out of grief, but out of love. She met people there, heard their stories, comforted strangers who were no longer strangers. The memorial trail had become more than a tribute. It was a lifeline, a place where the silence spoke and the trees remembered. One late summer evening, Megan sat once again at the halfway bench, listening to the wind in the branches. A young couple walked past, the woman brushing tears from her cheeks. As they passed, the man looked back and said softly, "Thank you. This trail, it brought her peace." Megan nodded, unable to speak. She watched them go, the leaves crunching beneath their boots, and felt her parents with her once more. not as a weight, but as a rhythm, a pulse in the land. And she knew then, with absolute certainty, that even in their final journey, they had led her exactly where she was meant to be. Years passed, and still the forest kept its secrets, but now it also kept its stories. The Echoes Trail had become something more than Megan ever imagined. What began as a daughter's way to grieve her parents had turned into a sacred path of memory for hundreds, perhaps thousands, of people who had lost someone to the wilderness. Every year, near the anniversary of her parents' disappearance, Megan would return to the trail and walk its full length in silence. Not as a tribute, but as a conversation. She often brought others with her, families she'd come to know. Through the foundation, hikers who once wrote to say the trail had changed them, children who left tokens at the story benches. Sometimes she walked alone, sometimes with Jeremy, who, despite the years, had remained her steady companion. He had never tried to fill the place her parents left behind. Instead, he stood beside her, step for step, quietly becoming part of her rhythm, her second breath. The drone he once flew that changed everything now sat in a display at the visitor center, enclosed in glass with a plaque that simply read, "What it found gave us back what we lost." Tourists stopped there often, some unaware of the full story, others whispering the tale to newcomers like passing down folklore. But for Megan, it wasn't folklore. It was life. And life, as she had learned, was more powerful when shared, when remembered. One autumn morning, Megan found herself back at the bench in the sunlit clearing, now weathered but strong. The carved quote still legible, "We danced, even here, especially here." Leaves rustled like soft applause around her as she sat, her hands folded in her lap. She was older now, her face marked gently with time, but her eyes carried the same steady light. A small group of teenagers passed by, pausing, at the bench. One of them read the quote aloud, his voice quiet with wonder. Then another girl asked, "Who said that?" Megan turned slightly, her smile soft. "My mother," she said. "She said it in a video we found just before she and my father disappeared." But even in their last moments, they found joy. The group listened, caught in the moment, their phones forgotten in their pockets. Megan didn't tell the whole story. She didn't need to. The trail spoke for itself. Later that day, as she walked back toward the beginning of the loop, she paused to add a new plaque beside a tree. It wasn't for her parents. It was for the trail itself. It read, "This forest remembers you, not for how you were lost, but for how you lived. Your story is not silence. It is song." She hammered it in with care, then stood back to take it in. A gentle breeze passed through the trees, scattering golden leaves at her feet, and for a moment, Megan felt time pause. She thought of the forest when she first arrived, cold, distant, cruel in its silence. But that silence had not been empty. It had been listening, waiting, holding. Now it echoed with voices, with laughter, with tears. And in its deepest places, where paths were still unmarked and the light fell in dappled fragments, it held more than memory. It held meaning. Years from now, she knew, people would continue to walk this trail. Some would come seeking closure. Others would come without knowing why, only to leave with something they hadn't realized they were missing. They would carry away pieces of stories, names carved in wood, whispers of love that refused to fade. And perhaps, just perhaps, they would come to understand what Megan had. That even when something is lost, even when it vanishes into the trees, with no trace left behind, it can still return in other forms. In footsteps, in wind, in the look of a stranger who understands your pain without speaking. That was what the forest remembered. Not the vanishing, but the return. Not the absence, but the imprint of presence. And in that understanding, Megan found peace. Not the kind that comes from forgetting, but the kind that comes from embracing everything. All the sorrow, all the beauty, all the mystery. She took one final walk through the trail that day, each step a soft echo of the ones who came before. As she reached the final curve, The forest opened up to the sun, and Megan paused, lifted her face to the light and smiled. The wind moved through the trees like a hush, like a breath. And if you listened closely, if you truly listened, you could almost hear it say, "They are still here." And so, dear listener, as we leave the forest behind and return to our own quiet lives, may this story linger with you like a soft breeze through the trees, a reminder that love, memory, and hope never truly vanish. Thank you, from the bottom of my heart, for staying with me through every step of this journey. Your time and attention mean more than words can say. If this story touched you, inspired you, or made you reflect on something deep within your own life, I would be so grateful if you'd take a moment to support this channel. Please click that subscribe button, give the video a like, and most importantly, leave a comment below. Share your thoughts, your feelings, or even your own story of love, loss, or discovery. I read every single comment, and your words truly breathe life into this space we've created together. Until next time, take care of yourself, hold your loved ones close, and remember, sometimes even the deepest silence carries an unforgettable echo.